I am trying to make this work. I don't know where my tripod is. It's one of like 5 places, but 4 out of 5 of those places are surrounded or near a kid who's sleeping or supposed to be sleeping. So there's a kid who's supposed to be sleeping. So I'm gonna try to give myself as little of a double chin as possible by doing things like this and this. How are you guys doing? How's quarantine? You surviving? Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. If you are new, my name's Lauren and I have 2 little boys. I have a 1.5-year-old named Maddox. He's actually 20 months old now, which means he's so close to 2. And I have a 3-year-old who is on the autism spectrum. We just recently got him diagnosed. And so in this video, I'm going to acknowledge the most asked question since I announced that Jackson is on the spectrum. And that is, what were the early signs? And I get it. I've been there. I have been there when you think your kid might be on the spectrum, and so you're doing all of this research and you're watching all of these videos and you want to know as many of the symptoms as you possibly can so that you can, you know, self-diagnose your son or have an idea. Obviously, this goes without saying, I am not a doctor. The only way to know for sure is to have your kid diagnosed and evaluated. Just because just because these are the symptoms that my son had doesn't mean that your kid, who very well might be on the spectrum, is going to have all of these symptoms. And just because your kid does do some of these things doesn't mean that they're on the spectrum. Those are the things that need to be said before I get into this, because there are going to be a lot of comments like, well, my son didn't do that, or, you know, just because a kid does that doesn't mean that they're on the spectrum. You're right, 100%. You don't need to tell me that. I am not a doctor. I am not here to diagnose your kid. Don't think that I am, and don't put that pressure on me. That's not what I'm doing. I'm just trying to show you what you might want to look out for. And if you are acknowledging these things and you notice these things in your kid, maybe it's time to get him evaluated, or him or her evaluated and potentially diagnosed. This is just a stepping stone, I guess. Okay, so the number one thing that I think pushed us in the direction of Jackson potentially having autism was his arm and hand flapping. When Jackson gets really excited, he flaps his arms and he kind of goes like this with his hands. That's a form of stimming, which you can research. He always did it when he was excited and he wasn't talking, and so we just always kind of thought, that's just how he shows he's excited. That's totally fine. But it was a lot. It was constantly. It was involuntary almost. It was excessive. It was very loud. Somebody commented on one of my videos and said that that could be a form of stimming, and we just kind of rolled our eyes at it, but it turns out that's what it was. Jackson, when he was younger, I would say, you know, around 12 months, he wasn't pointing. You know, I have this friend named Katie, and her son Jack would point at things that he wanted, things that were interesting. And my son Maddox has been doing that a really long time. He points at everything. Jackson didn't do that. The only way we could know or have an idea of what Jackson wanted was he would try to get it himself. He had no interest in trying to tell you what he wanted unless he had already tried to get it himself, and he couldn't. And so he started screaming to get your attention, but he never pointed. He never brought us over to anything. He has just started to do that. He started to drag us places he wants us to go so he can show us what we want or what he wants, but he didn't point, and Jackson just lacked in communication. Another thing I want to point out is there were a couple of things that I'm going to mention, but some of the things that manifested themselves later were not an issue. Jackson is severely speech delayed at this point, now that he's 3, but when he was like 9 and 10 months old, he was speaking fairly well for his age. When he wanted out of the bathtub, he said out. When he wanted us to pick him up, he said up. He said bye-bye and hi, which was crazy because we thought, oh, he's so advanced, he's going to be an early talker. And then when he turned about 18, 19 months, he just kind of stopped. If we really pestered him enough, he'd eventually say those words. But like I said, in communication, he just lacked. So he wasn't pointing, he wasn't speaking eventually. But he did start out pretty well, which was very interesting. obviously, like I said, a lack of speech. He's 3, but we noticed when he was 2, he wasn't saying very much, and then 2.5 came around and he wasn't saying much, and we got him into speech therapy and he qualified for that. But that's when they started to point out, like, I think it's more than just a speech delay. He doesn't engage with others. My same friend, Katie, her son Jack and Jax are 2 weeks apart, and so he would kind of play with him, but it was usually Jax doing something and then Jack coming over and trying to play with him. And Jax would just kind of do his own thing. He wasn't interested in him. For example, this is actually something that bugged me. It drove me crazy because they'd say when he was like 2, does he play with other kids? And I thought, how does like a 2-year-old play with other kids? You know, like, they're not gonna play house. They're not, like, how do you play with another kid? Because they're not good at sharing. They're kids. One thing I've noticed with Maddox that I've realized is him attempting to play is Maddox always wants to be involved in whatever Jackson is doing. If Jackson is playing with a toy, then Maddox comes over and he doesn't try to take it from him for the most part. You know, it happens, but he doesn't try to take it from him. He just tries to play with it too. And Jackson never, ever, ever did that. And he doesn't do that now with Maddox. He plays with what he wants to play with. If he sees something that you have and he wants it, he'll try to take it, but he doesn't want to play with you. He wants that toy. He was really, really into wheels. He still loves cars, and Maddox is really into cars too, but he loved to just spin the wheel, and he'd just watch it spin, and then he'd go and he'd spin it again. And he used cars normally, like in a typical sense. He'd roll them around and play with cars typically, but he loved the wheels of the cars. He loved to spin it, and on like his little exerciser thing he had when he was a baby, he'd spin it and just watch it spin. And we always thought it was really amazing because we thought it was really cool that he could do that at such a young age, but he got really obsessed with just the wheels. He doesn't do very well with eye contact. He's not as bad as you would think. I think when you think autism, you think, oh, he never looks you in the eye. He looks at us, and he's always been pretty good with that, but he also doesn't respond to his name very well. It took a couple of times before he'd even acknowledge that we had spoke. And I didn't think much of it. I just thought he doesn't realize that's his name. He's too into what he's doing. But having a second kid and seeing the way that he's doing things is really making me realize, and obviously Maddox isn't perfect. I'm not saying he's a perfect kid, and he's not speaking much either, but there are so many things that he is doing that Jackson didn't do. And as my first kid, I just didn't notice that he wasn't doing these things. You know, you don't have anything to compare it to. Jackson was just always kind of in his own little world, and we loved it because we didn't really have to entertain him very much. You'd give him a toy and he would play with it by himself forever. He's getting a little bit more interactive and wants more to do with us now that he's a little bit older, but when he was a baby, he just played with whatever he wanted to play with, and he was totally happy doing that. He had no real care that we were there and didn't need us to have fun. He had fun by himself. He'd, you know, flip through the books by himself. He'd play with the cars by himself. He really didn't need us to participate at all. And that's just not typical behavior. Now that he's getting older, he's bringing stuff to us, and Maddox always has. And along with that, he didn't really care what things were. And obviously at a certain age, like when they're younger than a certain age, they can't say like, oh, what's this? But Maddox right now will point to a picture in a book, and he's been doing this for a little bit. He'll point to a picture in a book and he'll look at me. He wants me to say what it is. And Jackson's doing that now too. But when he was younger, he didn't care. He didn't care what this word was. He didn't care what this was called. He didn't care whatever, because he just wasn't interested in it. And so the more I'm getting to see Maddox and where he's at for 1.5, the more I'm realizing where Jackson, I guess, should have been. And I really, it sounds awful that I'm comparing my one kid to my other, and I'm not trying to put down Jackson at all. But I'm just trying to explain to you what I've noticed, because a lot of these things I didn't notice until I had another kid. And a kid who, I am not saying that Maddox is better than Jackson in any way. That's not remotely what I'm saying, and I don't want anybody to think that at all. Maddox just has more typical behavior, and Jackson's on the spectrum. And so I'm trying to show you what a typical child, or talk to you about what a typical child might do, and where a child on the spectrum might be and what they might do. It's not comparison to compare my children at all. It's just, you know, you did never know that there was anything off about a child if there wasn't something else to compare it to. And so now that I have another child to compare it to, I can see a little bit more what people were saying, because when people first started acknowledging that Jackson might be autistic, I didn't believe them. Maddox was still really young and wasn't really showing anything. Like, he's about where Jackson was, because up until like 1.5, Jackson seemed completely typical. And now that he's getting a little bit older, I'm understanding them a little bit more. I'm understanding what they meant when they said he should be doing this and he's not, because it just didn't make sense to me. And now that I'm seeing a kid at that age doing all of those things, it's easier to understand, it's easier to see where they're at, and it's a little bit easier for me to acknowledge. Honestly, knowing that Jackson is on the spectrum has honestly been a huge blessing. I think it gives us a lot more patience with him. It helps us understand who he is a little bit more and why he does certain things. And that, along with that, is patience. He's amazing. He's a very, very smart kid. It's not that I want him to be put on a lower pedestal. I don't want people to expect less of him, but I want people to have more realistic expectations. And I think that that's something that I've been able to do since having him diagnosed. I've been able to have more realistic expectations for him, and I've been able to acknowledge his strengths more. Now that we actually have a diagnosis, it's not so much looking for what is wrong with my kid. It's us moving forward and trying to focus on his strengths. And that's been amazing. But thank you guys so much. Your comments on my last video were unbelievably supportive, and I appreciate you guys so much. And we'll see you in our next video.